In the previous lecture, we discussed how electrons interact with matter and highlighted the role of inelastic scattering in energy loss processes. We saw that these inelastic interactions are responsible for generating several important SEM signals. In this lecture, we focus specifically on X-ray generation, how X-rays are produced inside the interaction volume beneath the specimen surface. We will examine the physical origin of X-ray emission and understand why two distinct types of X-rays are generated during electron-matter interactions. This brings together the ideas developed over the last few lectures linking electron scattering, energy loss, and signal generation to the X-ray signals used for materials identification and analysis in SEM. When the incident electron beam interacts with the atoms in the specimen, two fundamentally different X-ray generation processes occur. The first produces characteristic X-rays which have discrete energies that are unique to each element. These arise from inner shell ionization followed by electronic transitions and form the basis of elemental identification. The second process produces Continuum X-rays, also known as Bremsstrahlung, which form a smooth background in the spectrum. These X-rays are generated when incident electrons are decelerated in the Coulomb field of atomic nuclei and are not tied to specific atomic energy levels. Any measured X-ray spectrum in the SEM is therefore a combination of sharp characteristic peaks superimposed on a continuous background. Continuum X-rays, also known as Bremsstrahlung, are produced when fast incident electrons are decelerated in the Coulomb field of atomic nuclei within the specimen. During this deceleration, electrons can lose any fraction of their kinetic energy, and that energy is emitted as X-ray radiation. Because the energy loss is not quantized by atomic energy levels, the resulting X-ray energies span a continuous range. As a result, continuum X-rays form the smooth background observed in X-ray spectra, on top of which the characteristic X-ray peaks are superimposed. In the continuum X-ray spectrum, there is a well-defined upper limit to the X-ray energy that can be produced. The highest energy X-ray corresponds to the extreme case where an incident electron loses all of its kinetic energy in a single interaction. This defines the short wavelength cutoff known as the Duane Hunt limit. Beyond this point, no X-rays can be generated because the electron does not have sufficient energy. Importantly, the position of this cutoff depends only on the accelerating voltage of the electron beam and is independent of the specimen material. Characteristic X-rays are generated when an incident electron removes a tightly bound inner shell electron from an atom. This creates a vacancy in one of the core shells, such as the K or L shell. To restore stability, an electron from a higher energy shell drops down to fill the vacancy. The energy released during this transition is emitted as an X-ray photon with a discrete energy equal to the difference between the two electronic energy levels. Because these energy levels are unique to each element, the resulting X-ray energies serve as elemental fingerprints. After an inner shell electron is removed, the atom is left in an excited and unstable state. To relax, the atom can follow one of the two competing pathways. In the radiative process, the energy released when an electron fills the vacancy is emitted as a characteristic X-ray photon. In the non-radiative process, that same energy is transferred to another electron, which is then ejected from the atom as an Auger electron. Which of these two processes dominates depends strongly on the atomic number, with Auger emission favored in light elements and X-ray emission becoming increasingly probable for heavier elements. The fluorescence yield quantifies how an atom relaxes after inner shell ionization, whether it emits an X-ray or an Auger electron. Formally, for the K shell, it is defined as the fraction of K shell ionization that result in K X-ray photons. This probability is extremely small for light elements. For example, carbon has a fluorescence yield of only about 0.005, meaning that almost all relaxation occur via Auger emission. As atomic number increases, X-ray emission becomes much more likely. By germanium, roughly half of all K shell ionizations produce X-rays. And for the heaviest elements, the fluorescence yield approaches unity. This explains why X-ray based elemental analysis is naturally biased towards heavier elements and why detecting light elements is fundamentally challenging. In the previous slide, we discussed fluorescence yield primarily in the context of the K shell. This plot extends that idea to the L and M shells. You can see that while the same trend holds, fluorescence yield increases with atomic number, the onset shifts to higher Z as we move from K to L to M shells. This means that for heavier elements, L and M shell X-ray emission becomes increasingly important, whereas for lighter elements, these shells are still dominated by Auger relaxation. The shell dependence of the fluorescence yield plays a key role in determining which characteristic lines are observable in EDX spectra. This slide connects the traditional X-ray shell notation to the modern quantum mechanical description. What we call the K shell in X-ray spectroscopy corresponds to the 1s label. The L shell consists of the 2s and 2p subshells, and the M shell includes 3s, 3p, and 3d, and higher shells continue in the same way. Because each subshell has a slightly different binding energy, transitions between specific subshells produce multiple closely spaced X-ray lines rather than a single line. This table shows which subshell electrons are allowed to fill vacancies in inner shells and how many electrons each subshell can accommodate. This directly controls which characteristic lines appear and how strong they are in an EDX spectrum. The key takeaway is that characteristic X-rays are a direct fingerprint of atomic electronic structure. This diagram shows how characteristic X-rays originate from atomic energy levels. When an inner shell electron such as K, L or M electron is removed, the energy of the atom increases because a vacancy has been created. The atom is unstable in this excited state and relaxes by allowing an electron from a higher shell to drop down and fill the vacancy. Each allowed transition releases energy in the form of an X-ray photon whose energy is exactly equal to the difference between the two electron energy levels. Because these energy levels are discrete, the emitted X-rays also have discrete, well-defined energies, giving rise to characteristic lines such as K alpha, K beta, L alpha, and M alpha. This is the fundamental physical origin of characteristic X-ray spectra in EDX. Not every electron transition between energy levels produces an X-ray. Only those transitions that satisfy quantum mechanical selection rules are allowed. For electric dipole transitions, which dominate characteristic X-ray emission, the key selection rule is that the change in orbital angular momentum quantum number L must be plus or minus 1. In other words, delta L equal to plus minus 1. This means an electron must move between orbitals of different angular momentum type. For example, from a p orbital to an s orbital, or from a d orbital to a p orbital. Now consider the implication. Some subshell to shell transition satisfy this rule and therefore produce characteristic X-rays. Other transitions violate the rule and those transitions are considered forbidden. When a transition is forbidden, characteristic X-ray emission does not occur. Let us look at the K series as a concrete example. Transitions from the L2 and L3 subshells to the K shell are allowed. These correspond to well-defined, well-known K-alpha lines. However, the L1 to K transition is forbidden under the dipole selection rule. Therefore, it does not produce a characteristic K-line X-ray. Understanding these selection rules is essential because they explain why certain X-ray lines appear in EDX spectra and why others, even though energetically possible, are never observed. Because the energies of atomic shells and subshells are discrete, the energy required to remove an electron from a specific shell is also discrete. This minimum energy is called the critical ionization energy or excitation energy. If the incident electron beam energy is below this threshold, that shell cannot be ionized, and no characteristic X-ray from that shell can be produced. The plot shows how the critical energies for the K, L, and M shells increase strongly with atomic number, with K shell ionization requiring the highest beam energies. This table shows critical ionization energies for platinum, niobium, and silicon. For silicon, K shell ionization occurs at only about 1.8 kV. So K X-rays are easily generated even at low beam energies. For platinum, the K shell critical energy is nearly 80 kV, far beyond typical SEM operating conditions. As a result, platinum K lines are not accessible in SEM, and analysis relies on L and M lines instead. This is why beam energy selection is always element dependent in X-ray micron analysis. Mosley's law describes how the energy of characteristic X-rays depend on atomic number. The energy scales with the square of the effective nuclear charge, written as Z minus a screening constant that accounts for inner shell electron shielding. The value of this constant depends on the X-ray series, with smaller screening for K lines and larger screening for L lines. The key consequence is that X-ray energies depend on atomic number rather than atomic mass. As atomic number increases, the spacing between energy levels changes in a regular way, leading to a predictable shift in characteristic X-ray energies. Because of this, each element produces X-rays at unique energies, which is why EDX can be used to identify elements based solely on peak position. The diagram shows all possible electronic transitions that can produce characteristic X-rays. To interpret it, the first thing to focus on is the final shell where the vacancy exists. If the vacancy is in the K shell, the emitted X-rays belong to the K series. If it is in the L shell, it belongs to the L series, and so on. The Greek letters tells us where the electron came from. An alpha line corresponds to a transition from the next higher shell, while beta and gamma lines come from progressively higher shells. Because each cell is split into subshells with slightly different energies, a single series actually consists of multiple closely spaced lines. These fine differences are why real EDX spectra show clusters of peaks rather than a single line. Characteristic X-ray lines are not perfectly sharp because the inner shell vacancies that produce them exist only for a very short time. When an inner shell electron is removed, the resulting core hole relaxes almost immediately through X-ray emission or audio processes. Because this lifetime is finite, the emitted photon cannot have a perfectly well-defined energy. This behavior is captured by energy-time uncertainty principles, which tells us that a shorter lifetime leads to a greater uncertainty in energy. As a result, each characteristic X-ray line has a small but finite width, typically on the order of a few electron volts. The natural width of an individual line increases for deeper core holes and for heavier elements, because those core holes decay more rapidly. At the same time, as atomic number increases, the energy separation between different subshell transitions becomes larger. This is why light elements often show a single unresolved peak, while heavier elements display multiple resolved lines as seen in the spectra here. Let us now discuss how line weights influence what we actually see in an EDX spectrum. Even when multiple transitions are allowed from the same shell, they do not all occur with equal probability. Different characteristic lines have different transition probabilities. And the intensity of a line in an EDX spectrum is directly proportional to that transition probability. This immediately explains an important observation. Alpha lines are generally the strongest. Beta lines and higher order transitions are weaker. For most elements, the K alpha line is much stronger than the K beta line. Similarly, in the L series, L alpha dominates over L beta and L gamma. And in the M series, M alpha is typically the most intense. As a result, EDX spectra are usually dominated by alpha lines. The weaker lines may still be present, but they are often difficult to detect. They can be hidden in the background or masked by overlapping peaks from other elements. Understanding this hierarchy of line intensities is critical when interpreting spectra, especially in complex or multi-element systems. And with that, we conclude our discussion on SEM signals and EDX spectroscopy. You now have a complete conceptual framework from electron-matter interactions to signal generation to X-ray formation rules and finally to spectral interpretation. In the next lecture, we will build on this foundation and move to the next characterization technique.